What I felt was something between shock and disbelief. But here's the thing. The ad lasted less than 3 minutes. Even so, it was enough to break decades of accumulated expectations. Alongside William, Catherine confirmed that the historic coronation ceremony will take place on June 2nd, 2027 at Westminster Abbey. William spoke with restrained firmness, but Catherine's slightly shaky breath revealed the weight of that moment. It wasn't just a date being announced. It was the moment when Great Britain recognized that the future had arrived sooner than expected. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any updates on this story. William gripped the edges of the lectern before repeating the date aloud. That brief pause said more than any speech could. June 2nd would occur 74 years after the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, connecting the new reign to the woman whose long service defined the modern British monarchy. Westminster Abbey, the ancient church where British monarchs have been crowned for centuries, would now be the place where a son would formally surpass his father. Catherine watched William with visible pride, but a sadness crossed her serene expression. She understood that the crown would not just change her titles. It would transform their marriage, tighten the family's privacy, and place George, Charlotte, and Louis under even more intense global scrutiny. The princess had spent weeks at William's side in private meetings with Charles and senior constitutional advisors and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the church leader who traditionally conducts the coronation ceremony. The cameras stopped. Silence filled the space. William turned to Catherine and asked in a barely audible voice, "Are you ready?" She reached out her hand towards him. "We need to be," she replied. The prince held his wife's gaze and understood that courage did not mean the absence of fear in either of them. Charles heard the same words from a private room at Clarence House. The king lowered his glasses, stared at the silent screen, and said nothing. His formal decision to transfer the throne had made that announcement possible, but hearing the date announced publicly turned a private agreement into irreversible history. Beside him rested a sealed coronation dossier, the official collection of plans regulating the ceremony, succession, and transfer of royal authority. Charles finally opened it. A line had been crossed out with black ink, and a replacement date had been handwritten beneath it. June 2nd was not the original choice. The initial plan called for a transition months later, until a confidential disagreement led William to demand it be brought forward. This dispute ran deeper than any aide had publicly understood. The nation had been given a date, but behind that serene announcement were 4 people whose personal sacrifices made that moment possible and whose loyalty was about to be tested in ways no one had predicted. Behind every coronation, there is a family forced to give up something that the public will never see. William needs to inherit the crown while his father is still alive. Catherine must become queen while protecting children who already live under the constant gaze of the world. Charles needs to liberate the institution that has defined his entire existence, and Camilla must face a future in which her influence ends the moment another woman receives the crown. William had prepared for kingship since childhood, but that preparation had never included this. He had imagined the crown coming through grief, not through a living father who voluntarily stepped aside, while still able to hear the bells announcing his replacement. That difference mattered. It converted duty into guilt and turned ascension into something dangerously close to betrayal. Catherine felt the same pressure in another way. She would become queen, the monarch's crowned partner, and the senior woman of the new reign. But he still had 3 children who needed protection from the institutional machinery that surrounded them. After the announcement, she walked into George's room and found him reading audience reactions on a tablet. He closed the screen gently and told him, "You are still allowed to be a child." The young heir looked at her and asked if this would remain true after the coronation. She promised yes, even though she knew the crown had already started to change his life. Charles was left alone with the red boxes he had opened throughout his reign. These were the sealed cases that carried the official state documents, requiring the personal attention of the sovereign. The king placed his hand on the last coronation dossier and then asked an aide to remove it. He believed that stepping aside would protect the monarchy from uncertainty, but a different fear tormented him. History might call his sacrifice a failure. Camilla understood this fear because her own future was narrowing. At Clarence House, she served Charles tea and asked if June 2nd had really been William's choice. The king did not respond immediately. That silence was enough. The date had emerged under pressure, not full agreement, and she realized that her influence would end the moment Catherine received the crown. Anne refused to let private pain become public harm. During a documented family consultation recorded by the private secretary, the Princess Royal warned her brother that any visible hesitation could weaken the two reigns. Charles listened, but his expression hardened when she said that dignity now depended on complete and unreserved support for her son. Catherine carried an additional secret. A trusted palace guardian had given him a private letter written by the late queen to the woman who would one day succeed her as the monarchy's senior female figure. It hadn't opened yet. William soon received more immediate warning. Charles would support the coronation, but only if one final condition was accepted. To understand why a father would impose conditions on his own son's coronation, we need to go back to the private ceremony that turned uncertainty into a point of no return. The path to June 2nd did not begin with a public announcement or a constitutional document. It began during a private service at St. George's Chapel, when Charles failed in an essential ceremonial movement, and William advanced without being instructed. For 12 seconds of silence, father and son stood under the same vaulted ceiling as each senior member of the royal family understood the truth. The crown had already started changing hands before anyone dared admit it out loud. Charles had struggled for months to keep up with the pace expected of a sovereign. He continued opening state documents, attending formal hearings, and appearing at ceremonies even as exhaustion followed him back through the palace corridors. William had quietly absorbed an increasing share of this burden, taking on additional meetings, investitures, diplomatic receptions, and constitutional consultations. An investiture is the formal ceremony in which honors are bestowed in the name of the monarch, while constitutional consultations are private discussions about the crown's legal duties. Each task the prince took on protected his father, but also made the transfer of power progressively more real. The breaking point came during a closed rehearsal of the Order of the Garter in St. George's Chapel. The ancient order is Britain's highest and oldest order of chivalry, and its ceremony relies on precise movements, strict timing, and strict hierarchy. Charles arrived at the designated point and stopped. He looked at the wrong side of the chapel and did not respond when the next movement began. William approached, whispered the correct instruction, and completed the sequence. Anne immediately signaled for the musicians to continue, hiding the interruption before it spread throughout the room. Charles waited until they reached the sacristy before turning to his son. The small private chamber used by clergy and ceremonial participants offered no protection from the anger in his voice. He accused William of appearing too prepared to take control. The prince tightened his ceremonial gloves and replied that he had acted because his father seemed afraid. That single word hurt the king more deeply than any public criticism could have done. Catherine found William alone soon after, still gripping the gloves so tightly that the leather had folded over his palm. He admitted that helping Charles had felt like a betrayal, because every instinct told him to protect his father, while every duty required him to prepare to replace him. She recalled that moving forward had prevented a public humiliation, but the future king could not escape the blame. Anne later confronted Charles in a recorded private family consultation. He told his brother that the incident in the chapel had not been humiliation. It had been a warning. A controlled transition could still preserve their dignity, while a sudden crisis could destroy it. Charles acted that same night. He ordered constitutional advisors to prepare two distinct plans: a regency, meaning a temporary transfer of royal duties, and a voluntary abdication, the permanent renunciation of the throne. The original coronation date had been set for autumn 2027, but William objected to the delay after receiving a confidential health and safety assessment. The king finally accepted on June 2nd. However, it required that a specific moment be removed, gone from the ceremony. This requirement would soon bring father and son together in the same room, without advisors, without cameras, and without ceremonial protection, and neither of them would leave without having been transformed. The confrontation began without raised voices. Charles sat at one end of a long table, William at the other, and between them lay the coronation program. A paragraph had been crossed out with black ink. It dealt with the moment when the former sovereign would take a public oath of loyalty to the new king. Charles called it an unnecessary humiliation. William called it the only gesture capable of ending months of dangerous speculation. Charles dismissed all aides from the private library and closed the door himself. The room belonged to the father and son. The coronation program, the official document that defines each stage of the ceremony, rested between them as a challenge that neither of them could ignore. The king pointed to the crossed-out section and said he would not kneel before his own son while millions watched. William held back his anger. He argued that the oath had not been designed to embarrass Charles. It was designed to give the country absolute clarity. Britain needed to see that the departing sovereign accepted the new monarch without hesitation, because a single gesture of uncertainty could fuel rumors of division, resistance, or a crown transferred under duress. Charles pushed the document across the table. "You prepared to receive it," he said. He was never prepared to give it up. The monarch's voice remained controlled, but the words carried years of sacrifice. His reign, however brief history would call it, had consumed his identity. Kneeling would reduce all of this to a single image of surrender. William stood up so abruptly that the chair moved back. He admitted that he had spent his life preparing for the death of a father. He had never prepared himself for something more painful, replacing a father who was still alive, conscious and capable of hearing another man called king. The prince said the crown didn't feel like a victory. It seemed to take something Charles still loved. The confession transformed the atmosphere in the room. Charles looked away and the anger on his face began to subside, but pride kept him immobile. For almost 2 hours, neither of them conceded the point. Catherine entered only after an aide informed her that the meeting had fallen silent. She found the document between them, and exhaustion on both their faces. The princess refused to choose a side. Instead, he asked whether either of them wanted the first lasting image of the new reign to be that of resentment between father and son. Charles eventually offered a compromise. He would take the oath standing up, recognizing William's sovereignty without appearing defeated. The future king accepted. Neither of them smiled, but the danger between them lessened. Then Charles revealed a deeper threat through a documented note from the Lord Chamberlain's office. Someone inside the palace had already contacted senior coronation organizers and attempted to alter the program without authorization. The agreement between father and son had reached a compromise. but the larger battle raged in private offices, ceremonial committees, and through the person who still believed he could reshape the succession. Real power rarely announces itself with shouts. It moves through altered schedules, private phone calls, revised guest lists, and names quietly removed from official documents. As William and Catherine prepared to inherit the crown, a second dispute unfolded behind the scenes. Camilla had no authority to stop the coronation, but she still had relationships built over years, and she intended to secure Charles's place before the new reign erased his influence. The Coronation Planning Board controlled much more than the ceremony itself. It defined the official program, ceremonial roles, invitations, transportation, security, and public form of the transition. William would become sovereign the moment the instrument of abdication, the legal document ending Charles's reign, came into force. But until that time, the king still held formal authority. This narrow range created room for influence, and Camilla utilized it. The queen consort privately contacted the Lord Chamberlain's office, the royal department responsible for major ceremonies and palace arrangements. Through a documented request sent to senior organizers, she asked that Charles's role be expanded and that a permanent ceremonial position be created for him after the abdication. He also proposed that they both enter Westminster Abbey immediately before William and Catherine, preserving the ancient hierarchy even as the crown changed hands. Catherine discovered the change when reviewing the papers, a most recent of the procession. His arrival had been brought forward by several minutes without any explanation. She marked the page, closed the folder, and asked the secretary not to alert William yet. The princess wanted to have a talk before the dispute became an open confrontation. Camilla received it privately and defended the request without apology. Catherine said the ceremony could honor the past without compromising the authority of the future. The queen consort responded that gratitude should never be confused with erasure. Her voice remained firm until Catherine asked what she was really afraid of. Camilla's control gave way. She admitted in a private conversation recorded by the palace secretary that she feared becoming irrelevant the moment another woman was crowned. She had fought for decades to gain acceptance, and now believed that the new reign would reduce her to a footnote. Catherine listened attentively, but refused to compromise the principle at stake. Personal fear could not be allowed to distort constitutional clarity. Anne intervened before the conflict escalated. The Princess Royal ordered organizers to remove each unauthorized revision and restore the approved program. He warned that mixed signals would make the transition appear contested, harming both Charles and William. Charles found out about what happened when he received the amended planning file. The king felt betrayed, not because Camilla wanted to protect him, but because her actions made him seem incapable of releasing his power. The final plan guaranteed him a dignified entrance before the wider family, keeping William and Catherine the undisputed center of the ceremony. The procession was restored, but the cost of this correction became evident when Charles returned home and confronted the woman who had tried to protect him without his permission. The public saw rehearsals, polite statements, and a monarchy moving forward with discipline. Inside Clarence House, the weather was considerably colder. Charles entered, placed the revised procession plan on the table, and asked Camilla a single question. Why had she acted on his behalf? Her response didn't start with politics. It started with fear. The fear that when William became king, the life they had built together would disappear overnight. Camilla admitted she believed palace organizers were already treating Charles as a retired figure before his reign had even officially ended. Each altered schedule and shortened appearance seemed to her a warning that he was being removed before he had chosen to leave. The revised procession plan, the document that determined where each member of the royal family would be positioned during the coronation, had seemed to her like a last opportunity to protect his dignity. Charles did not accept the justification. He told her that the intervention had strengthened exactly the suspicion he was trying to dispel, that he would not release the throne peacefully. Then the king removed his signet ring, the personal seal traditionally used as a symbol of royal identity and authority, and placed it next to the program. Symbols become dangerous, he said, when people value them more than trust. Camilla left without responding. She sat alone in the adjacent hallway as aides passed by at a careful distance. Nobody approached. The silence hurt more than any reprimand, because it confirmed that his influence had already begun to wane. William learned of the confrontation through a documented account from the palace secretary. His first reaction was severe. He wanted to exclude Camilla from all remaining planning meetings. Catherine stopped him. He warned that a punishment could turn a constitutional correction into a personal war, and that the new reign could not begin by humiliating those he claimed to want to reconcile. Catherine went to Charles in person. I told him that William's ascension did not require his disappearance. It required his visible trust in those who would succeed him. The monarch finally admitted that watching his son prepare for the throne was like watching his own life become history while he was still alive to witness it. She replied that history would judge how he had left power as deeply as it would judge how he had exercised it. The repercussions arrived quickly. Coronation documents were placed under stricter control. Each change now requires direct approval, and informal palace channels have been removed from the process. The move protected the transition, but it also exposed how much trust had eroded. George overheard part of a family argument, and later asked William if becoming king meant losing his father. The prince was paralyzed. The son's question revealed that the children were, "I'm absorbing every silence, every closed door, every tense conversation." William came to Charles that night not as an heir, but as a son. He found the office empty. On the table rested the still unsigned abdication document, the legal instrument that would permanently end the king's reign. The empty chair left William faced with the loneliness of succession until Catherine found him next to the unsigned document and forced him to face what he truly feared. No aide witnessed the moment that finally secured the coronation. There were no cameras, red boxes, or constitutional experts. Just William and Catherine standing together next to the document that would make them king and queen. He confessed that he was capable of presiding over a ceremony, but he could not promise that the crown would leave their family intact. She responded by placing the late queen's sealed letter between the two of them and breaking the wax seal. William did not hide behind duty. He admitted that his greatest fear was not failing as king, but becoming so consumed by the role that George, Charlotte, and Louis would grow up feeling the same emotional detachment that he himself had experienced as a child. The draft of the coronation oath, the formal promise a monarch makes to serve the country and uphold its laws, lay open beside him. But the future king could only think about the price that this promise could exact at home. Catherine confessed that she also feared the crown. I knew audiences would expect serenity even through exhaustion, grief, and private family tensions. The princess feared that strength was measured by how much pain she was able to hide. Then he unfolded the letter from the late queen, preserved by documented instruction left with a trusted guardian of the palace. The message was direct. He warned them never to confuse silence with strength or duty with the absence of love. The monarchy, the letter said, survives only when the people who bear the crown remain recognizably human within their own family. William read the words twice. Catherine watched his expression change as the weight before them turned from sentence to choice. William took the oath out of the folder and wrote a private promise beneath it. Their children would never be treated merely as future instruments of the institution. George, Charlotte, and Louis would understand duty, but they would also know affection, honesty, and freedom from fear. Catherine agreed to stand by his side, not as an ornament, but as an active partner. shaping the values of the reign that was about to begin. Charles entered only after his son invited him. William told the king that the new monarchy would honor his service without pretending that the transition had been painless. The monarch listened, then sat down before the instrument of abdication. Charles signed. He put down his pen and asked that history remember that decision as a protection, not a retreat. William replied that he would remember. Father and son briefly embraced, ending the conflict that had threatened to poison the coronation before it had even begun. Catherine held up the signed document, but did not call any advisor. He allowed both men a few moments of silence to come to terms with what had happened. A reign had ended, another had become inevitable. With the signing completed and the family finally united, the palace released the complete coronation program, and the world responded with an image that no private gathering could have predicted. By dawn, the coronation date had surpassed the palace walls and reached the streets. The newspapers carried the same image, William and Catherine holding hands after the announcement, with Charles visible in the background at the entrance. Photography captured succession without hostility and sadness without defeat. But the most powerful public reaction did not appear on the printed pages. It gathered outside Buckingham Palace, where 3 generations stood behind a single handwritten message. The palace released the full program shortly after dawn. It confirmed June 2nd, Westminster Abbey, the route of the procession, the ceremonial papers, and Charles's public oath of loyalty to the arriving king. Westminster Abbey is the historic church where British monarchs are crowned, while the procession route is the official route that the royal family follows before and after the ceremony. These details mattered because they demonstrated that the transition was no longer private, reversible, or hidden behind sealed doors. The media first highlighted an extraordinary fact. A living former sovereign would attend his own son's coronation. Some feared the moment would feel like a defeat. Others expected resentment. Then the national mood began to change. Hundreds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. A child held up a sign, the handmade one, above the crowd with the words, "Thank you, Charles. We're ready, William and Catherine." The words spread across the news in a matter of minutes. They honored the departing monarch without rejecting the future, and this balance became the emotional center of the day. One major broadcaster described the announcement as a service transition rather than a transfer born out of crisis. A national newspaper put the 3 royals on the cover with the headline, "One crown, 2 reigns, no civil war." Distrust began to give way to acceptance. William watched the crowd coverage with George at his side. The young heir said the plaque seemed to honor both his grandfather and his father. The prince looked away, visibly touched, because his son had understood what adults had struggled to express for weeks. Catherine received thousands of messages praising her as a mother and future queen. The response carried its own pressure, but it also demonstrated that the public expected the new reign to be more humane, more open, and less distant. Charles answered the last question through a recorded statement from the palace. The king declared that his confidence in William and Catherine was complete. Camilla remained beside him, but was silent. Afterwards, she met with Catherine privately and apologized for trying to alter the procession. Catherine accepted the apology, but clearly drew the line. Personal fear could never again interfere with public duty. Camilla agreed. The country had accepted the date. Charles had released the crown, and the family had survived their private battle, leaving only the ceremony that would define what the new reign truly represented. On June 2nd, 2027, the bells of Westminster Abbey announced more than the beginning of a reign. They marked the completion of a difficult promise between a father, a son, and the woman who had held the family together. William entered carrying the weight of expectations. Catherine walked beside him, carrying the strength of silent resistance. Charles arrived not as a defeated king, but as the man whose final act had protected the crown. William and Catherine entered together, making the significance of the day undeniable. This would not be a solitary rise to power. It would be a partnership. The coronation, the sacred ceremony in which a monarch is formally crowned and publicly pledges to serve the nation, rested the future of the monarchy upon the two. Shared entry demonstrated that duty would no longer be burdened in emotional isolation. Charles took his assigned place next to Camilla without hesitation. The former sovereign allowed the arriving couple to lead the ceremony, and the queen consort did not attempt to regain the influence she had feared losing. Their restraint mattered because a single misguided gesture could have revived all the bitter rumors the family had worked so hard to silence. The decisive moment came during the formal oath. Charles stood, looked directly at William,